I've always been a night owl. Something about the silence of the night just calms me, gives me peace. I've always loved being alone in my room with only the flicker of the TV for company, but I learned that night, one that I'll never forget, that sometimes silence isn't always what it seems. It was just another regular evening, or so I thought. I had just finished working on some assignments. It was around 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. I live in a small house not too far from the edge of town, and the neighborhood is relatively quiet. My parents had gone on a weekend trip to visit relatives, leaving me behind to manage things myself. I wasn't worried. I'd stayed home alone plenty of times before. But that night was different. There was this feeling in the air that I couldn't shake, like something was off. At first, it started with the subtle things. A creak on the stairs is the faint sound of a door closing when I knew I was the only one awake. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the house settling. But when the creaks started getting louder, I started to feel a little uneasy. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. The windows were open, and the old house made these strange noises sometimes. I was about to get up and close the window when I heard it. A soft tap, tap on the window. I froze. I didn't move. My heart raced, my breathing shallow. I slowly pulled myself out of bed and crept toward the window. It was pitch dark outside, but the tapping didn't stop. I could feel my stomach drop. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. I tried to peer through the window, but it was so dark that I couldn't see anything. My mind raced with all the worst possible scenarios. Someone trying to break in, a prankster, or worse, something I didn't even want to think about. But still, I couldn't bring myself to open the window. I backed away, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a tree branch, maybe a stray animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It felt like someone was waiting for me to make a move. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents, but I knew they wouldn't be awake. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it was coming from downstairs. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was someone trying to sound like they were speaking to me, but it wasn't right. The voice had an unnatural edge to it, like it wasn't fully human. I stood frozen, my phone clutched in my hand, and my mind screamed at me to do something. Anything. I couldn't call the cops, not yet. There wasn't any proof. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, telling myself that I was being dramatic, but I couldn't let go of the feeling that I was being watched. I moved slowly, carefully down the hall. The house was eerily still, except for the soft whispering that seemed to be coming from the kitchen. I reached the stairs, my grip tightening on the knife. My feet barely made a sound as I descended into the darkness below. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. The kitchen light was on, and I could see the outline of the table and chairs. The whispering continued, but now it sounded more like muffled laughter. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen with fear, but when I finally forced myself to move forward, the laughter stopped. I couldn't make sense of it. There was no one in the kitchen, and nothing seemed out of place. But my heart still hammered in my chest, and the unsettling feeling only deepened. I turned to look behind me, almost expecting to see someone standing right there in the doorway. But no one was there. I slowly backed into the living room, keeping the knife out in front of me. The whispers returned, but they weren't coming from the kitchen anymore. They were closer, in the hallway, just behind me. The soft shuffle of footsteps echoed in the dark, and I spun around, holding the knife in front of me like it might protect me. Nothing. Again. But I couldn't explain it. I felt like there was something just out of view, something I couldn't see. I couldn't keep standing there. I needed to leave, to get out of the house. I turned to grab my keys from the counter, but something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. A shadow moved. It was quick, like the flicker of something you almost don't notice before it's gone. My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to look again, but there was nothing. The living room was empty. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my keys and rushed for the front door. As I swung it open, I felt a cold blast of air, the kind that sent chills down my spine. I hesitated, glancing back one last time at the dark house. The whispers had stopped, but the air felt thick, oppressive. I ran outside into the yard, not daring to look back. I didn't even know where I was going. I just had to get away. I ended up pacing, I think, in the front yard for what felt like hours, but every time I tried to calm myself down, the feeling of being watched returned. That deep, suffocating sense of dread. Finally, when the first light of dawn started creeping over the horizon, I summoned the courage to go back inside. I checked every room, every corner of the house, but it was empty. Nothing was out of place. No signs of anyone having been there. My phone was still in my hand. No missed calls or texts from my parents. The silence that greeted me when I returned was deafening. There was no more whispering, no more footsteps, just an overwhelming, all-encompassing quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with me, something that had been watching me all night, waiting for me to make a move. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the truth is, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in that house again. I haven't spent a night alone there since. My parents came home that morning and I told them what happened, but they just chalked it up to being tired or imagining things. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. I'll never know for sure. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
I still remember that night, like it was yesterday. The house was silent, the kind of silence that's unsettling, like the air itself is holding its breath. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second stretching longer than the one before. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that something was off. The lights flickered, a slight glitch that made me glance up, but I didn't think much of it. I lived in an old house, and that kind of thing was common. It was past midnight, and the weight of sleep was starting to pull me under. I had just moved into this house a few weeks ago, a charming little place on the outskirts of town. The neighbors were distant, the kind of people you only see when they need something. The house had its quirks, creaking floors, old pipes that groaned in the night, and a general feeling of being forgotten. But I liked it. It was quiet, peaceful. At least that's what I thought. I had just settled into bed when I heard it. A faint knock, like someone tapping on a door. My eyes snapped open, my heart thudding in my chest. I lay still, listening. It came again, this time more distinct, followed by a soft scraping sound. It was coming from downstairs. I told myself it was just the house settling. Houses make noises, right? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I got up, my legs shaking as I moved toward the stairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone screen. I held it in front of me, its dim light casting eerie shadows across the walls. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed louder than the last. I reached the landing, my hand gripping the railing for support. The sound came again, a low, rhythmic knock, followed by that same scraping noise. It was coming from the living room. My mind raced. I considered calling the police, but then I remembered I'd just moved in. No one even knew I was home. Who could it be at this hour? My heart pounded as I slowly descended the stairs. The air was thick with tension, like something was watching me from the shadows. I reached the bottom and paused, listening. The knocking had stopped, but the scraping sound was still there, faint but persistent. I took a deep breath and stepped into the living room. The room was empty, just the shadows of the furniture in the moonlight. There was no one here. I felt foolish. Maybe it was an animal, something small, scraping at the walls or the floor. But then I saw it, a dark shape in the corner of the room, barely noticeable in the dim light. It looked like a shadow, but it wasn't right. It was too solid, too alive. I froze, unable to move. The shape shifted, a slow, deliberate movement. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a whisper. It was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, clear and chilling. Help me. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. The shadow moved again, and then, as if it sensed my presence, it turned toward me. I couldn't see its face, just a vague outline of something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. It was just a presence, a feeling, something that made the air taste like metal in my mouth. And then, in a voice that was as cold as the grave, it spoke. You shouldn't be here. I couldn't run. I couldn't move. It was like my body had turned to stone, paralyzed by fear. The shadow moved closer, its shape twisting and contorting in ways that shouldn't be possible. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, my voice lost to the terror that clutched at my chest. It was only a few feet away now, and I could feel the cold emanating from it, a cold that chilled me to the bone. Suddenly, the room felt even darker. The shadows seemed to grow, swallowing the light from my phone. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere had changed. My phone flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. I reached out, feeling the walls, trying to find something to steady myself. The sound of breathing filled the room, but it wasn't mine. It was slow, ragged, like something was struggling to breathe. "Leave," the voice whispered again, louder this time. I don't know how, but I managed to turn and stumble toward the door. I had to get out. I had to escape. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling as I gripped it. But before I could open it, I heard a loud crash behind me. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house, trapping me inside. I whipped around, my heart racing. The shadow was gone. But the air was still thick with something, an oppressive presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. I backed away slowly, every instinct telling me to get out, to run. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I turned to the window, my only hope of escape. But as I looked outside, my blood ran cold. There, in the yard, standing under the pale moonlight, was the shape. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a figure, a person, or something pretending to be one. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I backed away from the window, my mind spinning. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, the fear constricting around me. I needed to do something, anything, to break free from this nightmare. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could help. And then I saw it, an old book, sitting on the coffee table. It was tattered, worn, as though it had been there for years. Without thinking, I grabbed the book and flipped it open. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to do something. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages still. And then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it. A page that had been bookmarked. A strange symbol drawn in the margins. The words on the page were in a language I couldn't read, but something about it seemed familiar. Desperate, I muttered the words aloud, hoping for anything to happen. The air around me grew colder, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The house was silent again. The figure in the yard was gone. The oppressive feeling that had clung to the room lifted, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe. I don't know if it was the words I said or if the thing just decided to leave. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to that house again. The feeling of being watched, of being trapped, stayed with me long after I left, and to this day, I can still hear the whisper in the back of my mind. Don't come back. I don't know what that thing was. Maybe it was a ghost, maybe something worse. All I know is that it's still out there waiting just beyond the veil of this world, and I don't think it's finished with me yet. Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
It was late at night when I got home, the kind of late where the streets are empty, the streetlights flicker, and the only sounds are the rustling of wind through the trees and the occasional distant car. My house was at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone. But tonight, there was a strange stillness in the air, something I couldn't quite place. I walked up the porch steps, fiddling with my keys, the metal jangling in the otherwise silent night. I didn't feel afraid, not exactly, but something about the way the night felt made me hesitate at the door. I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was just tired from a long day. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of my home wrapped around me like a blanket, and I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. It was comforting, familiar. I locked the door behind me and flicked on the light in the hallway. The house was quiet, as it always was when I came home alone. I was living by myself, having recently moved to this neighborhood after a messy breakup, and while I enjoyed the peace and the solitude, I sometimes found myself wondering what it would be like to have someone else around, just someone to share the silence with. But that night, That feeling of wanting someone, anyone around, felt even stronger. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and kicked off my shoes, dragging myself toward the bathroom to wash up. As I walked down the hallway, the house creaked underfoot, the familiar sound not doing much to settle my unease. I stopped just short of the bathroom when I saw something that made my stomach turn. The front door was wide open. My first instinct was that I had forgotten to lock it, but I knew I hadn't. I always double-checked. I stepped forward slowly, my feet heavy with dread. I peered through the doorway and into the dark street beyond, but nothing moved. There were no shadows lurking, no sign of anyone being there, just the open door. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Could I have really left it open? I didn't think so. I was certain I had locked it when I came in, but if I hadn't, why hadn't I noticed earlier? I walked over and shut the door, locking it again. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the wind had blown it open, maybe it wasn't locked properly. I didn't know. I returned to the bathroom, trying to calm my mind as I washed my face and stared into the mirror. My reflection was tired, eyes puffy, as though the weight of the past few days was showing. I turned off the bathroom light, and as I did, I saw something move in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the darkness, but then it happened again. A shadow, just out of the corner of my vision, darting past the living room. It wasn't the way a shadow should move. It wasn't just a shape, but a figure. A person. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. The house felt colder all of a sudden, the silence suffocating. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the reflection from the streetlight outside, casting strange shapes through the windows. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my skin prickled with a feeling I couldn't shake. I quietly walked back into the living room, my eyes scanning every corner. There was no one. No sign of anyone having entered the house. I checked the back door too, double locked and secure. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I was on edge, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a physical presence, not exactly. It was a sensation, something cold, distant, like a shadow that clung to the edges of the room, just out of reach. I decided to distract myself. Maybe if I sat down, had a drink, calmed my nerves, I'd feel better. I made my way to the kitchen, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping up my spine. As I opened the fridge, I noticed the strange sound again. It was coming from upstairs, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I knew no one else was in the house. I was sure of it. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, as though someone was moving something heavy across the floor above me. My heart skipped a beat, and I almost dropped the glass in my hand. My first thought was to call someone, call anyone, but my phone wasn't in my pocket. I must have left it in the living room. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my hands shaking, and slowly made my way to the stairs. The sound grew louder as I got closer to the bottom of the staircase, now unmistakably like something, or someone, was moving across the floor of the second story. I reached the stairs and stopped, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of it. The house was still dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside the window. I couldn't see anything up there, but the scraping didn't stop. It seemed to echo in the walls. I told myself to be brave, that it was probably just the house settling or a rodent. But the more I stood there, the less I believed that. My legs felt frozen in place, my mind racing with scenarios far worse than a rat or creaky floorboards. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to take the first step up the stairs. The sound stopped. I froze. There was no noise. The house was eerily still again, the silence stretching so thin I could almost hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I moved up a few more steps, trying to be as quiet as possible, but the second I reached the top of the stairs, the door to my bedroom, which had been closed, was wide open. The door. It hadn't been opened before. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't just leave it. I stood in the doorway, staring into the dark room. Nothing seemed out of place. My bed, my dresser, all just as they should be. But the moment my eyes scanned the room, I felt it. A presence. It was in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, something I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, it moved. A figure, tall and thin, dark as the shadows it blended with, and for one terrifying second it was staring directly at me. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark pits, black holes that seemed to suck in all the light around it. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything but getting out of that house. I didn't stop running until I was sitting in my car, parked a few blocks down, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't go back. Not that night. Maybe not ever. I tried to call the police, but my phone was dead. I didn't have the strength to go back inside to charge it, not with that thing, whatever it was, still in there. I don't know what I saw that night, but I haven't been back in the house since. I don't think I ever will. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
I'll never forget the night I spent alone in that house. I had just moved to a small town in Ohio, hoping for a fresh start after a messy breakup. The house I rented was old, but it was cheap, and it seemed like a perfect place to rebuild my life. The kind of place you could get away from everything. A cozy little spot far from the hustle and bustle. I'd been living there for about a month when it happened. I was used to the creaks and groans of the house settling at night. It had that familiar old house smell. Dusty wood, aged wallpaper, a little musty. It didn't bother me much, but on this particular night, the house felt different. It felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. It was late, probably around midnight. I was in the living room, watching a movie on the couch, the only light coming from the flickering TV. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with silence, the kind of silence that you feel deep in your chest. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft thud, like something had fallen upstairs. My heart skipped. I froze. But then I told myself, it's just the house settling. I'd heard noises before, right? Still, there was something about that sound that made my skin crawl. My eyes darted around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was just paranoid. After all, I was alone, and in the dark, your mind plays tricks on you. I turned the TV back on, but I couldn't focus. Every shadow seemed to grow larger. Every creak in the house echoed too loudly in my ears. Then there was another thud. This time it came from right above me. The floorboards creaked and groaned like someone was walking around upstairs. My blood ran cold. I was certain no one else was in the house. The landlord, an older man with a rough demeanor, had mentioned that no one had lived in the upstairs rooms for years. They were just too old, too unsafe to be used. But the noises, they didn't make sense. No one could be up there. I sat frozen on the couch, my breath shallow, every instinct telling me to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. It was then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint that at first I thought I imagined it. Help me. The voice came from upstairs. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. Someone was up there. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling. I called the landlord, but he didn't answer. I tried calling a few friends, but no one picked up at that hour. The whisper came again, this time louder, more desperate. Please, help me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced and my heart pounded in my chest. Should I call the police? No one would believe me. It sounded too crazy, like something straight out of a horror movie. I decided to go upstairs and check, even though my every instinct screamed at me to run. The staircase creaked under my weight as I slowly made my way up to the second floor. The air up there was colder, and it smelled different, damp, like something had been rotting. I reached the top of the stairs and paused, my breath visible in the freezing air. The hallway stretched out before me, long and dark, with only a faint sliver of moonlight seeping through the dusty windows. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. Please, I'm here. Come find me. I don't know what compelled me to keep going, but I did. I walked down the hall, past the two closed doors. One of them was slightly ajar, a sliver of dark space beyond it. The whisper seemed to be coming from that room. My heart raced, but I had to know what was happening. I had to know what was making that sound. I pushed the door open, the hinges squeaking loudly in the silence. The room was empty. It was an old bedroom with faded wallpaper peeling off the walls and dust covering the floor. There was a broken bed frame in the corner, the mattress sagging and torn. But there was something else, a small wooden box just sitting in the middle of the floor. It didn't belong there. I took a few steps toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My fingers hovered over the box, unsure whether to touch it or not, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl from behind me. The air seemed to grow even colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath. I turned around, my body frozen in fear. There was nothing there. The growl had come from inside the room, but the room was empty. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. Something wasn't right. I knew that now, more than ever. I took a few slow steps backward toward the door, never taking my eyes off the empty space in the room. And then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, angrier, like something was right behind me. The air around me seemed to crackle with tension. I turned to run, but before I could make it out the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. Panic flooded my veins. I hammered on the door, screaming for help, but no sound escaped. I could feel someone watching me. I wasn't alone. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just at the edge of my vision, a figure emerged. It was a woman, but her face was obscured by long, matted hair, her body contorted in unnatural ways. She moved toward me slowly, dragging one of her legs behind her like it was broken. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, and I could feel the words vibrating in my chest, but all I could hear was the low growl that rumbled from the depths of her throat. In that moment, I knew I was in the presence of something ancient, something evil that had been lying in wait for years. I had disturbed it. I had opened the door to whatever was trapped here, and now it wouldn't let me go. I didn't know how, but somehow I managed to get to my feet. I ran for the door, and this time I didn't stop. I broke the door down with my shoulder, falling into the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I bolted down the stairs, out of the house, and into the cold night air. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I ran to my car, my legs shaking uncontrollably, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that house. I don't know what it was, whether it was a spirit, a demon, or something else entirely, but I know one thing for sure. That house was cursed. And whatever it was that lived there, it wasn't done with me. To this day, I can't sleep at night without hearing that voice. The voice of the woman who begged me for help. And no matter where I go, I can still feel her eyes on me, waiting for the moment when I'll let my guard down. Are you hooked on these spine-tingling stories? Subscribe to get more and never miss a scary moment.
Next story.
It was one of those quiet nights where everything felt off, like the world itself was holding its breath. I had just finished working late on a project for my job. The only light in the apartment was from the dim glow of my desk lamp. I wasn't tired, just mentally drained. I figured I'd head to bed soon, but for the time being, I decided to relax and watch a bit of TV. It was a Thursday, and I was alone. I'd just moved into the apartment a few months ago, an older building in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The landlord had warned me that the place was a bit outdated, but it was affordable, and I didn't mind the creaking floors or the occasional odd sound. The neighbors were all pretty quiet too, which I appreciated. It was just me, and that night it felt like the entire world had slowed down. I sat on the couch, remote in hand, flicking through channels, but nothing caught my attention. I was about to turn the TV off when I heard something, a soft sound. It was almost imperceptible, like a faint tapping. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The tapping continued, rhythmic, as though someone was knocking on the wall. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. But then it happened again, louder this time, more insistent. My stomach twisted in discomfort. The sound wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the window. The tapping was light at first, almost playful, but there was something unsettling about it. I leaned forward, my face just inches from the window. Nothing. The street outside was empty, the only movement coming from the branches of the trees swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was the wind or a bird. After all, it was an old building. I stood up, walked to the window, and checked the street. No one was there. I walked back to the couch, feeling a little silly. But before I could sit down, I heard it again. This time it wasn't just a tap, it was a knock. Someone was knocking on my window. My pulse quickened. I couldn't understand it. Who would be at my window at this time of night? I turned back to the window. Slowly, cautiously, I lifted the blinds. The glass was cold against my palm as I peered outside. There was no one there. But then, a shadow shifted in the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the yard, moving. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the dark figure standing at the far end of the yard. It was motionless, too still, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. My first instinct was to call the police, but something in the back of my mind warned me against it. What would I even tell them? I think there's someone in my yard? I was alone, and it was just past midnight. Who would take me seriously? I backed away from the window slowly, trying not to make a sound. I wanted to grab my phone, but my hands were shaking. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the space around me had gotten smaller. I moved toward the door, not sure what I was planning to do. Maybe just step outside, confront whoever or whatever was there. But as I got closer to the door, I heard it again. A soft knock. I turned around, heart hammering in my chest. The sound wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from inside the apartment. The knock echoed through the hallway, clear and deliberate, as though someone was standing just on the other side of my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat. No one should be inside. I was sure I had locked the door before I came out to the living room. But the knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. I stood frozen, my mind racing, my body unwilling to move. Then the door creaked. It sounded like it was opening. I grabbed a nearby chair, raising it over my head like some kind of weapon, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My heart was in my throat. Whoever or whatever was in my apartment was getting closer. The floorboards creaked under the weight of someone approaching. I thought about running, but the hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel, dark and suffocating. It was too late to escape now. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, from the shadows of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was a woman. She was wearing a long, dark dress that hung loosely around her body, her hair falling in messy strands around her face. But it was the look in her eyes that froze me. Empty. Hollow. She stared at me as if she knew everything about me, as if she had been watching me for far longer than I could comprehend. Her skin was pale, almost sickly white, and her lips were twisted into an unsettling, almost mocking smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me, her eyes unblinking. I couldn't tear my gaze away from hers. I felt like I was suffocating, like she was pulling me in with some invisible force. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my body paralyzed with terror. The woman's smile grew wider, her lips stretching impossibly far across her face. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, sending me crashing to the floor. As I scrambled to get up, I heard her whisper, so softly I thought it was my own breath. "It's too late to run." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but as I looked around in a panic, I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, one by one. They were all the same, pale, hollow-eyed, silent. They moved toward me slowly, purposefully, and my body was still too frozen to react. The woman in front of me reached out a hand, her fingers long and thin like claws. Suddenly, a crash sounded from the far side of the apartment. The front door flew open, and the light from the hallway flooded into the room. My body snapped into motion at the sight. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the door, pushing past the shadowy figures. I didn't care who or what they were anymore. I ran. I ran out of the apartment and into the night, not stopping until I was a few blocks away, gasping for breath. I don't know how long I stayed out there, huddled on the curb, too afraid to move. When I finally gathered the courage to return, the apartment was empty. The door was locked, just like it had been before. But I never went back inside, and I never will. Want more thrill and suspense? Hit subscribe now and stay haunted with our ghost stories.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. A break from the city, from the constant noise, the rush of deadlines, and the suffocating pace of life. I had found the perfect cabin in the woods, nestled deep in a quiet forest on the outskirts of town. The pictures online had shown a rustic yet charming place with a crackling fireplace, large windows overlooking a serene lake, and a sense of isolation that seemed ideal for recharging. When I arrived, everything was just as I had imagined: quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the chaos of daily life. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and an old-fashioned charm that made it feel like a retreat from the modern world. I spent the first day unpacking, settling in, and even taking a walk through the forest, enjoying the cool air and the sound of leaves rustling underfoot. By the time night fell, I had settled into a comfortable routine. I lit the fireplace, made myself a hot drink, and curled up in an armchair with a book. The only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire, the occasional gust of wind against the windows, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was then that I first noticed it: the sound. At first, it was faint, just a soft creak like something moving upstairs. I dismissed it as the house settling, but then the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the house settling. It was too deliberate. I set my book down, straining to listen. The creaking was followed by a slow, rhythmic thumping like footsteps above me. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one else here. I was alone. I stood up, my skin prickling with unease. I glanced at the stairs leading to the second floor. The sound seemed to be coming from up there. The house was old, sure, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was the wind or maybe a squirrel or raccoon outside, but something about the sound didn't sit right. The footsteps were too heavy, too intentional. I hesitated for a moment before walking slowly toward the stairs. Each step I took seemed to amplify the noise, the thumping growing louder. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, it sounded like someone was pacing back and forth upstairs, their footsteps quickening as if they knew I was coming. With a deep breath, I took the first step onto the staircase. The floor creaked under my weight. I continued climbing, each step feeling heavier, as if something was pulling at me, urging me to turn back. When I reached the top, I stood there for a moment, my heart racing in my chest. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark. Only a faint light from the moon outside filtered in through the window, casting long, eerie shadows on the wooden floor. The footsteps had stopped. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my eyes darting to each door as I passed. The sound had completely disappeared. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again, a door creaking open. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The door at the end of the hallway, which I was sure had been closed when I came upstairs, was now slightly ajar. My mind screamed at me to leave, to turn and run back downstairs, but my body moved forward on its own. I approached the door, my hands clammy with fear. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, there was nothing but a small, dusty bedroom. The bed was unmade, and the air smelled stale, as if no one had been in here for a long time. But then I saw it. On the far side of the room, in the corner near the window, there was a figure standing perfectly still. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, but I could make out the vague outline of a person. A man, perhaps, though his features were indistinct, shadowed. He was staring out the window, unmoving, as if he hadn't noticed me. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream, to get away from whatever this was, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the figure turned. His face, if you could call it that, was pale and gaunt, his eyes dark voids that seemed to pull in the light around him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was as if he were trying to speak, but his voice had been stolen. I didn't know how, but somehow I turned and ran. My feet slammed against the floor as I bolted down the stairs, out of the cabin, and into the cold night air. I didn't even stop to grab my things. I just ran. The woods around me were silent, the only sound the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat in the car for a long time, not daring to go back inside, even though I could see the cabin from where I sat. Silent, still, as though nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. The figure in the bedroom, the hollow eyes, the impossibly still movement. It was real. I left the cabin that night, not looking back. I didn't even go to the authorities. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain something like that? The next day, when I called to cancel my reservation, the woman on the other end of the phone was almost too cheerful, as if nothing had happened. She mentioned the cabin in passing, but then her voice dropped almost too casually as she asked, "Did you go upstairs?" I froze. "What do you mean?" Did you go upstairs? She repeated, her voice softening. That's where he's been since he died. Who? I asked, my throat dry. The last tenant, she said. He stayed there alone, just like you. He never left. No one ever saw him leave. We think he still lives there. I didn't wait for another word. I hung up, my hands shaking. I knew what I'd seen, the man in the room, standing by the window, just waiting. And now I know he's still there, pacing in the halls, waiting for someone to come up those stairs. Maybe that's why I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something is following me. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I always feel like someone is watching from behind, waiting for me to make a wrong move. I haven't returned to the cabin, and I'm not sure I ever will. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the house is too quiet, I can hear the footsteps again echoing in my mind. And I know it's him. Feeling spooked? Subscribe for more terrifying tales that will send chills down your spine.
Next story.
I was never one to believe in the supernatural. Growing up, I scoffed at the idea of ghosts, spirits, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. I thought people who claimed to have experiences with the other side were either imagining things or trying to get attention. But that all changed one night when I found myself trapped in my own home with something I couldn't explain. It was a cold, rainy night in late autumn. I had just moved into a small, older house on the outskirts of town. The place was perfect for someone like me, quiet, affordable, and surrounded by trees. I didn't mind that it was a little rundown. In fact, it added a kind of charm. There was an old fireplace in the living room, creaky wooden floors, and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. It felt cozy, like it had a history, and I liked that about it. I had been living there for about a week, unpacking boxes and adjusting to the space. The first few days were uneventful. But that night, as the storm raged outside, something shifted in the air. The wind howled through the trees and the rain lashed against the windows. But it wasn't the storm that gave me the chills. It was something else. Something wrong. I had just finished making quick dinner and was sitting on the couch watching TV when I noticed it. A cold draft. It wasn't the kind of draft you'd expect from an old house. This one felt different. I glanced around trying to figure out where it was coming from, but all the windows were shut tight. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. The lights flickered. I rolled my eyes, telling myself it was just a power surge from the storm. I stood up to grab a blanket from the closet, and as I walked down the hall, I heard something. A faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, a soft, low murmur coming from somewhere near the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. I froze in place. There was no one else in the house. I had checked every room just minutes before. I waited, straining my ears to hear it again. The voice came again, only this time it sounded more distinct. It was almost like someone was talking just out of reach, their words muffled but unmistakable. Help me. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a figment of my imagination brought on by the storm, the creaky house, the eerie quiet of being alone. But then I heard it again. Help me, please. I swallowed hard and slowly stepped toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The voice was coming from there. I was sure of it. I turned the corner, my breath catching in my throat. The kitchen was empty. The light above the sink flickered once more, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice, now more urgent, echoed in my mind, and for a moment I thought I could almost see someone standing there, just beyond the doorway. But when I stepped forward, there was nothing. Only the stillness of the house. I checked every cabinet, every drawer, under the sink. Nothing. No one. I was alone, but the voice kept ringing in my ears. It was as if it was coming from the walls themselves. It wasn't a sound you could trace. It was a presence, a feeling, something that wasn't right. Something was in the house with me. I decided to leave, to get some air and clear my head. But as I reached for the door, I felt something behind me, a sudden pressure, like someone had just stepped into the room with me. I spun around, heart pounding, but once again, no one was there. The house felt wrong now, suffocating. I couldn't stay in that kitchen, so I bolted to the living room, the only place that felt remotely safe. But even there, it was like the air had thickened, as if the walls were closing in around me. And then I heard it again. Help me. This time, it wasn't coming from the kitchen. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could pinpoint. It was just in the air, a whisper that seemed to float through the room. The temperature in the house dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. It was freezing, and the chill sank deep into my bones. I was paralyzed, unable to move, but I didn't want to move. I didn't want to see what was coming. Please, help me. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like it was right next to me now, as though someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran for the front door, my heart hammering in my chest, but when I reached the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. It shouldn't have been locked. I didn't lock it. I hadn't locked it. I turned around, panicking, and the room seemed to shift before my eyes. The furniture, the walls, everything felt like it was closing in on me. The temperature dropped even further, and my breath came out in visible clouds. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was all around me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a blur, a shadow moving against the wall. But as it grew clearer, I could make out the figure of a woman. She was standing in the doorway to the hallway, her body hunched as though she were crouching, waiting. Her face was obscured, but her eyes, those eyes, they glowed with an unnatural, sickly green light. She didn't move. She just stood there staring at me, her mouth moving as though she were whispering something, but I couldn't make out the words. I backed away, but the door was still locked. I tried again, desperately twisting the knob, but it wouldn't open. My chest tightened, and I felt like I was suffocating. And then, as if it had never been locked at all, the door swung open with a force that nearly threw me back. Without thinking, I ran out into the stormy night, barefoot and shivering, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was standing in the middle of the street, drenched and gasping for air. I looked up at the house, my heart pounding, and I could have sworn I saw a shadow in the window watching me. I didn't go back. I didn't want to know what was in that house, or who had been trying to reach me. But I know one thing for certain, there's something in that house, something that's been there long before I moved in, and it won't let me forget. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
I had always been the type of person who believed in logic, in reason. Ghost stories were for children. Old houses creaked and groaned because of settling foundations, and strange noises were just the wind or animals. But that all changed the night I stayed at my aunt's house. She had asked me to stay there while she was out of town, keeping an eye on the place. It was a massive old house built back in the 1800s. Dark wood, tall windows, and a huge staircase that led up to a second floor and an attic that always seemed to call to me. I remember walking through the house and feeling that chill in the air, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It wasn't the cold that made it strange, but something else. Something in the way the house seemed to breathe. Like it had a life of its own. That first night was nothing out of the ordinary. I made dinner, sat in the living room, and tried to settle in. But when the clock hit midnight, something happened that I can't explain, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. A soft thudding noise, almost rhythmic, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off. It was probably just the house settling, right? But it kept going, steady and deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to get up and investigate, but the other part of me screamed not to. I didn't know what was up there, but that sound, so constant, so purposeful, made my blood run cold. I grabbed the flashlight on the nightstand, my hands trembling slightly, and tiptoed to the hallway. The house was silent now, the noise having stopped as suddenly as it had started. But I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I climbed the stairs cautiously, the old wood creaking under my weight. The darkness upstairs was thick, suffocating, but I forced myself to move forward. I reached the top of the stairs where the long hallway stretched out before me. The doors to the bedrooms were shut, but the attic door was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of light spill out. I walked down the hall, drawn toward the attic. The closer I got, the stronger the sense of unease became. It was as if something was waiting for me in that room. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to find out what was inside. But I couldn't help it. I pushed the door open, and the air inside hit me with a musty, ancient smell. Dust hung in the air like a cloud, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. The light flickered overhead, and I could see old furniture covered in white sheets, old trunks stacked high, and piles of forgotten things. But the strangest thing was the sound. It had started again, the thudding. But this time it was louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor, but from one of the old trunks. I froze. My flashlight flickered. My hands began to shake. The thudding continued, rhythmic and heavy as if something was trapped inside, banging against the sides of the trunk. I knew I should leave. I knew this was a bad idea, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the trunk, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling as I gripped the brass handle of the trunk. The thudding stopped. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. I hesitated, staring at the trunk as if expecting it to spring open at any moment. But nothing happened. The silence dragged on, and then, just as I was about to let out a breath of relief, the air shifted. A chill swept through the room, colder than anything I had felt before. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft but clear, coming from inside the trunk. "Help me." I stepped back, my heart racing. The voice was faint, like it was coming from a great distance, but it was unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away from the trunk, panic rising in my chest. I didn't want to know what was inside. I didn't want to know who or what was whispering to me. I turned to leave, but as I moved toward the door, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, almost desperate. "Please." I froze in place. My mind was screaming at me to run, to leave the attic and never come back. But something pulled me toward the trunk, an invisible force that I couldn't fight. It was like I was no longer in control of my own body. With trembling hands, I reached for the trunk again. The moment I touched it, the air around me seemed to change, to shift. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and then the lid of the trunk creaked open by itself, as if some unseen force had unlocked it. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. But then, something moved within the darkness. A figure, a shape, rising from the depths of the trunk. It was a man, or at least something that resembled one. His eyes were wide and empty, black holes that seemed to swallow the light. His mouth was stretched in a grotesque grin, his teeth sharp and yellow. He reached out toward me with hands that were skeletal, the fingers long and twisted. His voice was barely a whisper, but I could feel it vibrating in my bones. "Let me out." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped, locked in a gaze with this thing, whatever it was. My body was frozen, unable to react, unable to scream. I could feel my skin crawling, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it all began, the figure vanished. The trunk slammed shut with a deafening thud. The room returned to silence. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. My head spun. What had just happened? Was it real? Or had I imagined the whole thing? I don't know how long I sat there in the attic, too terrified to move, but eventually I gathered the courage to leave. I ran down the stairs, out of the house, and didn't stop until I was standing outside, breathing in the cool night air. That night changed me. I don't know what I saw in that attic, or what I heard, but I'll never forget it. I haven't been back to that house since, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplained, better left untouched. But there's one thing I know for sure. The next time I hear a whisper in the dark, I won't be sticking around to see what it wants. Feeling spooky? Keep the chills coming by subscribing to our channel for more ghostly stories.
Next story.
It started with the phone call. I had just finished a long day at work. It was late, and the only thing I wanted was to sink into my couch, watch a mindless TV show, and forget about the chaos of the day. As I was about to grab the remote, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway, thinking it might be a wrong number or someone I had forgotten to save. "Hello?" I answered, a little groggy from the day. There was a long pause on the other end. At first I thought it was a prank or a telemarketer, but then a voice, soft and slow, finally spoke. "Is this Emily Walker?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the voice, but something about it felt wrong. The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it was clear enough that I could hear the coldness in it. "Yes, this is Emily," I replied, trying to sound calm, though a knot was tightening in my stomach. The voice continued, its tone almost like a whisper, sending a chill down my spine. "Are you alone right now, Emily?" I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my back, but I answered anyway, forcing the words out. Yes, I am. Who is this? There was another long pause, and then the voice spoke again, but this time it was much closer to the phone. It sounded as though it were right in my ear. You shouldn't be. I almost dropped the phone in shock. I was about to hang up, but before I could, the line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, my thoughts racing. Who was that? How did they know my name? And what did they mean by, you shouldn't be? Shaking off the unsettling feeling, I decided it was probably just a prank. Maybe one of my friends trying to mess with me. But no one had called me all evening, and certainly not with a voice like that. Still, I tried to shrug it off and continued with my evening. I made myself a cup of tea and settled onto the couch. It was almost midnight when I finally decided to go to bed, brushing the strange call aside as nothing more than a weird occurrence. But then the noises started. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the wind outside knocking against the window, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the direction of the front door. Tap, tap, tap. I lay in bed, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The house was old, and I'd heard sounds like this before, creaks and groans from the old wood, the house settling in the night. But the tapping wasn't stopping. It was getting louder. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the nagging thought that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. Slowly, I slid out of bed and tiptoed to the hallway. The sound was coming from the front door, the wooden door that led to the outside world. My pulse quickened as I approached. There, just beyond the door, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. With a trembling hand, I reached for the doorknob and hesitated. My mind screamed at me to open it, to see who or what was on the other side. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in around me. Finally, I turned the knob. The door swung open with an eerie creak, but there was nothing there. I peered into the darkness outside. The streetlights were dim, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but there was no one in sight. The air was cold, too cold for a late spring night. I stepped outside cautiously, looking around, but the street was empty. The tapping had stopped. Just as I turned to head back inside, I heard something else, a voice, faint and whispering, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Emily? I'm still here. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. Just the empty street, the distant hum of the city. My skin crawled. I rushed back inside and locked the door, leaning against it, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then the phone rang again. I didn't want to pick it up. My hands were shaking as I reached for it, but something told me I had to. I had to know who was on the other end. I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello? My voice barely registered, sounding weak and small. The same voice from earlier, the cold whisper, came through the phone once again. This time it was much clearer, like it was coming from inside the house itself. You should have listened, Emily, the voice said, its tone almost mocking. You shouldn't have opened the door. I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. My hands were slick with sweat. I wanted to call the police, but I couldn't think straight. It felt like my entire world had shifted into something unexplainable. There was no one outside, and yet I could feel it. Someone or something was watching me. I grabbed my phone again, intent on calling for help, when I heard something else. A slow, deliberate dragging sound. It was coming from upstairs. A scraping like nails on wood. I didn't think. I ran for the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, my feet carrying me against my will. I reached the top of the stairs, the sound now louder, closer, like something or someone was coming down the hall toward me. The scraping sound stopped abruptly and everything fell silent. I stood frozen, waiting, hoping that I was just imagining things, that it was all just some twisted dream. But then I heard a knock. A slow, deliberate knock on the door of my bedroom. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same rhythm, the same steady tapping as before. And I knew without a doubt that whatever it was, whatever was out there, it had found its way inside. I turned, but the hallway was empty. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. I ran, grabbed my coat, and bolted out the door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, out of the neighborhood, and into the cold, quiet streets of the town. I never went back. I moved away the very next day, changed my number, and did everything I could to erase every trace of that house. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear it. The knocking, the voice, and I know it's still out there, waiting. Scared yet? Subscribe for more tales from the dark side that'll send shivers down your spine.
Next story.
It was a quiet, unassuming Wednesday evening when everything started. I had just moved into my new apartment, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building. The kind of place that wasn't glamorous, but it had its charm. The building itself was ancient, with creaky stairs and a smell of old wood that seemed to linger in every corner. But to me, it was perfect. I had always wanted to live in an older place. It felt like there were stories hidden in the walls, stories waiting to be discovered. I had spent most of the day unpacking, but now, with the boxes stacked neatly against the walls, I was ready to finally sit down, relax, and unwind. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into the living room, the only space in the apartment that was fully furnished. The light from the lamp on the table cast a warm glow over the room, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. It came from the door. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor, someone checking in, maybe offering to lend a hand or introduce themselves. I stood up and made my way toward the door, a smile already forming on my lips as I opened it. But no one was there. I frowned, stepping out into the hall. It was empty, no sign of anyone, no sounds. The hall was dark with only a few dim lights scattered along the way. I glanced up and down, but there was nothing. No one. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the long day of moving in. I closed the door and went back to my tea, but just as I sat down again, the knock came again. It was louder this time, more insistent. My stomach dropped. I stood up, hesitating. I couldn't ignore it this time. There had to be someone out there, right? I opened the door, almost expecting to see someone standing there, but again, there was no one. I was about to close it when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door frame, the edges of the door. They were scratched. Not deep scratches, but long, thin marks that looked like something had been scraping against it, as though someone had been dragging something sharp along the edge. I ran my fingers along the marks, a shiver crawling up my spine. I hadn't noticed them before, and they weren't there when I first opened the door. I took a step back, my mind racing. There was no way the marks could have appeared just in the few seconds it took to open and close the door. My thoughts were interrupted by another knock, this time coming from inside the apartment. I froze. I didn't even need to move to know that the sound was coming from the bathroom. I tried to tell myself it was the pipes. Old pipes made strange noises, right? But this sound, it wasn't like the usual creaks of an old building. This was a deliberate knock. A tapping against the wall. And it wasn't just one tap, it was a rhythm, almost like a knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. I could feel my pulse quickening as I stood motionless in the living room. The apartment seemed to be holding its breath, the air thick with something I couldn't quite explain. I didn't want to go near the bathroom, I didn't want to see what was in there, but I couldn't ignore it either. Slowly, I moved toward the bathroom, my heart pounding louder with each step. The door to the bathroom was ajar, just a crack, and the light inside flickered. I pushed it open just enough to peer inside. Nothing. It was empty. I stepped in and looked around. There was nothing unusual. No one. The mirror reflected the ordinary sight of the sink and shower, but something caught my eye, a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant that it sent a wave of dread through me. The sink. The faucet. It was dripping. That wasn't it, though. The drip wasn't like a regular drip. It was too rhythmic, too steady. It was like someone was controlling it. Knock, pause, knock, pause. The sound of the water dripping in perfect time with the tapping I'd heard earlier. I swallowed hard and quickly turned off the faucet, but the knocking didn't stop. It was still coming from inside the bathroom. But now it wasn't from the walls, it was coming from the mirror. I couldn't breathe. The reflection in the mirror, it wasn't mine. For a split second, I thought it was my own face, twisted and distorted. But no, it was someone else's. Someone who looked like me, but their eyes, those eyes, they were hollow, black, like deep voids where no light could reach. The knocking grew louder, now accompanied by a soft, scraping sound. The figure in the mirror raised its hand and placed it against the glass. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The figure's hand slid down the glass, and as it did, I could see the faint outline of scratches forming beneath its fingers. Scratches that weren't just on the mirror, but on the entire room. Deep, jagged marks that appeared as if someone was trying to claw their way out. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the mirror, it was coming from behind me. I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. But there was no one there. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I bolted from the bathroom, not caring that I was knocking over chairs and knocking into walls. I ran to the front door, not even bothering to look back, and threw it open. I didn't stop running until I was out in the street, breathing in the cold night air, my heart still racing. I looked up at the apartment building, expecting to see lights on in the windows, people moving around, but there was nothing. The windows were dark, lifeless. I didn't go back, not that night, not ever. I never found out who or what was in that bathroom or how it had gotten into my apartment, but I know this much. Something was there, something that wasn't human. And whatever it was, it wanted out. Don't miss out on more hauntingly good stories. Subscribe now.
Next story.
It was a rainy Friday evening when I found myself at the old gas station just off the highway. It was the kind of place most people pass by without a second thought, dilapidated, abandoned, and forgotten. But something about it caught my attention. I had been driving for hours and I was tired, desperate for a break. The road had been long and empty, with no sign of civilization for miles, and this place, despite its rundown appearance, looked like it might offer some relief. The station's neon lights flickered in the downpour, casting an eerie glow across the cracked pavement. I pulled up next to the pump, glancing around. There was no one else around. The gas station was out of service, but I figured I could stretch my legs for a moment, maybe use the bathroom if it was open. I didn't see any cars or people, but I could hear the distant hum of something, a low, constant buzzing sound that seemed to come from everywhere. I got out of the car, the rain hitting my skin like needles. The wind whipped through the parking lot, carrying with it an odd, metallic scent. As I approached the building, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. My curiosity piqued. I stepped in. The interior of the gas station was dimly lit with shelves of old, dusty products, the kind that no one had bought in years. The flickering lights overhead added to the atmosphere, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air smelled stale, like mold mixed with gasoline. But what really unsettled me was the silence. Not a sound except for that low, buzzing hum. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely audible over the rain outside. No answer. I walked deeper into the station, heading toward the back where I assumed the restroom might be. The closer I got, the more I felt something was wrong. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the strange buzzing. It was a feeling, a sensation crawling up my spine. It was as if I wasn't alone. I pushed the door to the restroom open, but before I could step inside, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in the hallway just beyond the restroom door, was a man. He was tall, dressed in a worn-out gray coat, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. His posture was strange, unnaturally stiff, like he had been standing there for far too long. His eyes were fixed on me, but there was something off about them. They were wide, unblinking, almost empty. I froze, my heart skipped a beat. The buzzing sound seemed to get louder, vibrating in my chest like it was coming from inside my head. I took a step back, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, his face expressionless. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't respond, just stood there, unblinking, like a statue. His silence was suffocating. I took another step back, not knowing why, but feeling the need to get away from him. The buzzing sound was now deafening, filling the entire space, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door. But as soon as I made it outside, the buzzing stopped, and the rain suddenly felt heavier. The night seemed darker, colder. The wind howled, and I saw something in the corner of my eye, something moving. I looked to my right, and there, standing near the far edge of the parking lot, was the man. His eyes were still fixed on me, but now he was joined by two other figures. They were identical, dressed in the same tattered clothes, their faces obscured by their hats. I froze in place, heart pounding. The man began to walk toward me, his movements stiff, mechanical. The others followed in perfect sync, like they were part of some twisted ritual. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to take my eyes off them. The buzzing had started again, louder this time, shaking the ground beneath my feet. As they got closer, I could see that their eyes were not eyes at all. They were hollow, black pits, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. "Help me," a voice whispered from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone. The figures were almost upon me now, their twisted, unnatural movements growing more frantic, their mouths open as if to speak, but no sound came out. The air felt suffocating, oppressive. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I broke free from the trance. I turned and sprinted for my car, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. My heart was in my throat, pounding with fear. I couldn't look back, not once. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, closer now, and the whisper of something almost recognizable. "Come back." I reached my car, fumbled with the door handle, and jumped inside. I started the engine without hesitation and slammed the gas pedal to the floor, driving away in a panic. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were still following me. The road ahead was empty, and the buzzing sound was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something had followed me out of that place. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I haven't been able to get that gas station out of my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I see those hollow eyes staring at me and hear that buzzing just out of reach. The next time I passed through that area, the gas station was gone, nothing but an empty lot where it had once stood. There was no sign of the man or the others, but I know what I saw, and I can still hear the whisper in the back of my mind. Come back. Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
It was a dark and stormy night when I moved into that house. The kind of night where the wind howls like a wolf, the rain pelts the windows like bullets, and the world outside feels as though it's holding its breath. The house I just bought was old, a 2-story Victorian tucked away on the edge of a small town in Michigan. I had always wanted a house like this, full of character and history. And after years of city living, I was ready for a change. The first few days were uneventful. The house was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how high you turned up the heat. But it was also quiet, almost too quiet. No street noise, no people, just the distant murmur of the wind and the occasional rustling of the trees outside. I thought I'd found my perfect retreat. That changed on the third night. I had been unpacking most of the day, setting up furniture and sorting through boxes, so by the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I decided to take a break, curl up on the couch, and watch a movie. I didn't think anything of the creaking sounds or the groaning of the house. It was old, after all. Everything creaks. It wasn't until around midnight when I first heard the knocking. Soft at first, like someone gently tapping on a door. I froze, my body stiffening. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't even unpacked the spare room yet. The knocking came again, a little louder this time, like someone trying to get my attention. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But as the knocking persisted, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the room at the end of the hall, the room I hadn't yet ventured into. I got up, heart pounding, my steps echoing in the empty house. The wind outside howled louder, as if encouraging me to go on. I reached the foot of the stairs and stood there for a moment, listening. There was no sound except the rain tapping against the windows and my own breath. Then the knocking came again, sharp, quick, almost insistent. I climbed the stairs slowly, trying to keep my footsteps light, my mind racing. I wasn't sure if I was hoping to find an explanation or if I was dreading what I might find. As I reached the top, the hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering lamp at the far end. The knocking had stopped, but I still felt that presence, like someone or something was waiting for me. I moved down the hall, each step slow, deliberate. The room at the end of the hallway stood before me, its door slightly ajar. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath. The door creaked as I pushed it open, my heart thundering in my chest. The room was empty, or so it seemed. There was an old wooden wardrobe in the corner, a dusty rug on the floor, and a large window that looked out into the dark, rain-slicked yard. But something was off. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't quite place. And then I saw it. A shape in the corner of the room, just beyond the wardrobe, hidden in the shadows. It wasn't a person. It was something else. A dark figure, just barely visible, like a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, on me. My blood ran cold. I backed away, but as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I spun around, my panic rising. The figure was closer now, standing in the center of the room, its form twisting and shifting like smoke. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, and it was suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry and my body felt paralyzed. The figure took a step toward me, its form becoming clearer, more defined. And then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, the words curling around me like a suffocating fog. "This place was never meant for you." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body rooted to the spot. The figure reached out, its hand a dark, skeletal thing, and I could feel the cold, icy touch of its fingers brush against my skin. In that instant, I snapped out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, slamming into the door in my frantic attempt to escape. The door flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I never went back into that room. I packed up my things and left the next morning, never looking back. I didn't know what that thing was or why it was there, but I knew one thing for sure. The house wasn't just old. It was haunted. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when the wind howls through the trees. And even now I can hear that voice whispering to me in the back of my mind. "You shouldn't have come here."